Michael Harris had never been the kind of man who decorated his home with flags or posters or any of the loud declarations that some of his neighbors favored. His way of showing respect was quieter, steadier, almost invisible to those who were not. Looking closely, and yet for him it carried more weight than anything else. Every morning, just after dawn, when the air was still heavy with the chill of the night and the street remained empty of children rushing to school or commuters hurrying to their cars, he would take the time to remove his neatly pressed uniform, jacket from the cedar hanger in his closet, brush off the invisible dust, and hang it carefully on the wooden rack attached to the front porch. It was the same jacket he had worn during his last deployment, the one with the faded stitching on the cuffs and the buttons polished smooth by years of habit, the one he had sworn he would preserve as a reminder of where he had been and who had stood beside him. He did not hang it to boast or to draw attention, but because seeing it there, catching sight of it every time he stepped outside, reminded him that his survival had a meaning, and that the house he now lived in was not simply another suburban property, but a place earned and defended at a high price. The neighborhood itself had been chosen deliberately. He wanted quiet, clean streets, an environment where the routines of ordinary life could anchor him after years of instability. The houses were orderly, the lawns trimmed, the mailboxes uniform, and there was something soothing about the predictability of it all, even though Michael had always been wary of homeowner associations and the rigidity they imposed. He convinced himself that he could live with the rules, because the calm was worth it, and besides, he was not the kind of man who broke regulations without reason. Yet, despite his best intentions, the uniform became a silent statement that unsettled some of the residents. A few nodded politely when they passed by, perhaps out of courtesy or genuine respect, while others averted their eyes as though the jacket was an accusation hanging in plain sight. Michael never confronted them, never asked what they thought because he had long ago accepted that most people lived in a world that could not truly understand the weight of fabric stitched with memory. Still, there were moments when he noticed small changes that hinted at disapproval. Conversations on the sidewalk would lower in volume when he approached, and neighbors who once offered cheerful greetings now kept their distance, suddenly fascinated by their phone screens or the cracks in the pavement. He could not decide whether it was suspicion, discomfort, or simply indifference, but he felt the shift all the same. The only constant was his own ritual. Hang the uniform, take a slow breath, and remind himself that silence was preferable to confrontation. The porch became his quiet battlefield, the jacket his flag. On the morning that marked the beginning of the conflict, the sun had just risen over the neat row of identical mailboxes when Michael noticed a white envelope tucked into his slot. At first he assumed it was another circular from the HOA announcing seasonal guidelines or a reminder about trash collection schedules. He opened it without thought as he carried it inside, but the language struck him like a cold slap. Violation notice, it read at the top in bold letters, and beneath that, an explanation that his display of unapproved decorative material constituted a breach of the community's aesthetic code. A fine of $200 was being assessed, with further penalties if the display was not removed immediately. He read the letter twice, then a third time, each repetition twisting the meaning deeper into something absurd. Decorative material. The uniform was not a string of holiday lights or a lawn gnome. It was his, and it had been with him through deserts, through nights when silence could mean death, through mornings where hope was scarce. Now it was reduced to the same category as clutter. For a moment he laughed, because the absurdity was too heavy to absorb any other way. But as the laughter faded, anger began to take root, heavy and sharp. The uniform had never been about anyone else's approval. It was his ritual, his acknowledgement of service and survival, and the thought of removing it at the order of a committee that had no idea what it meant felt like erasing part of himself. He placed the notice on the kitchen counter, smoothed the paper with both hands, and stared at the words until they blurred. He had been prepared for many battles in his life, but not for one where the enemy was bureaucracy disguised as neighborly order. And yet, deep down, he knew that the moment he received that envelope, the uniform had already become more than a private reminder. It had become a challenge, a test of whether he would once again stand his ground, this time not in the dust of foreign soil, but on the clean, quiet streets of his own neighborhood. Michael did not act immediately after receiving the notice. Instead, he folded the paper carefully and slipped it into a thick binder where he kept every bill, tax receipt, and mortgage document since the day he had bought the house, a habit formed out of necessity during his years in service when every piece of paper could mean the difference between clarity and chaos. For 2 days he tried to ignore the gnawing thought that the fine was more than just a misunderstanding, convincing himself that it would be resolved with a simple conversation. The uniform remained on the porch, untouched, displayed with the same meticulous precision as always. But on the third morning another envelope appeared, this one with red lettering across the front, the kind of deliberate intimidation that bureaucracies favored when they wanted obedience without discussion. Inside was not just another fine, but a warning that failure to comply could result in legal action up to and including the initiation of lien procedures. The words were clinical, stripped of humanity, but Michael felt the threat coiled tightly within them. He knew he could not let the matter slide. With the letter folded into his jacket pocket, he walked to the HOA office located at the far end of the development, a low building tucked between a nail salon and a real estate office. From the outside, it looked harmless, almost absurdly mundane, with faded posters about neighborhood cleanup days taped to the glass door, but as Michael stepped inside, he was struck by the deliberate sterility of the place. The walls were bare except for a framed list of community bylaws, the font so small that it was unreadable from more than a foot away. A woman at the reception desk glanced up briefly, her expression neutral, and asked for his name without any greeting. After typing something into her computer, she told him curtly that the board president, Don Whitmore, would see him in a few minutes. When Don finally appeared, his handshake was limp, his smile mechanical, the kind of smile that seemed practiced in a mirror rather than born of genuine warmth. He gestured for Michael to follow him into a small office that smelled faintly of disinfectant and stale coffee. On the desk lay a thick binder, the cover embossed with the HOA seal, and beside it a stack of envelopes identical to the one Michael carried. Don sat down, steepled his fingers, and asked in a tone that combined politeness with faint condescension what had brought him in. Michael placed the letter on the desk and explained that the so-called decorative material was not a banner, not a sign, not an ornament, but his military uniform, a personal possession that he displayed for reasons of memory and respect. He expected at least a moment of hesitation, some acknowledgement that this was not an ordinary case, but Don's eyes remained cold, his expression unmoved, and he responded by saying that rules applied equally to all residents and that exceptions could not be made for personal items regardless of their sentimental value. Michael leaned forward, speaking with controlled patience, asking how it was possible that a garment, folded and hung with care, could be equated with plastic flamingos or political slogans. Don's response was to reach into the binder and pull out a photocopied page from the bylaws, sliding it across the desk with the authority of a man who believed paper outweighed conscience. Michael's eyes scanned the section highlighted in yellow. No unapproved items shall be displayed on exterior structures in a manner visible from the street. It was vague, deliberately so, and when he pointed out that such wording could mean anything from a child's tricycle to a seasonal wreath, Don simply shrugged and said, "That is why the board has discretion, and in this case the board has determined your display to be in violation." The finality of his tone was meant to end the discussion, but Michael noticed something unusual in the document. One of the signatures at the bottom belonged to Mr. Kendall, the neighborhood's longtime architect whose obituary Michael remembered attending the previous spring. He tapped the name with his finger and asked almost casually how it was possible for a dead man to approve the bylaws updated only 2 months ago. Don did not flinch, but his eyes flickered for a fraction of a second, and then he leaned back and said that Kendall's name was there because the document had been renewed from older records and that nothing about it was irregular. The explanation rang hollow, and Michael left the office with the distinct sensation of having walked into a room where the rules were written not to protect order but to shield manipulation. Outside, the sun was already high, the streets filled with children riding bicycles and retirees tending to their hedges, the perfect image of suburban peace, and yet Michael felt as if a shadow had settled over the neighborhood. That evening, when he sat on the porch and looked at the uniform, he felt the weight of the notice pressing against him like a stone. The jacket seemed suddenly fragile, vulnerable to forces that did not understand it and did not want to. He thought of the men and women he had served with, of the ones who never came home, and he wondered what they would think if they knew that a piece of cloth once worn in their honor was now deemed an eyesore unfit for suburban streets. 2 days later, when Michael checked his mail again, he found not a notice but an official-looking document folded into a stiff envelope. The header read, "Preliminary Lien Notification," and listed his property address with the wrong lot number. At first he thought it a clerical error, but as he read further he realized that it referenced unpaid assessments that had never been billed to him. The amount was arbitrary, a sum that seemed plucked from nowhere, and the dates of delinquency predated his actual purchase of the house. As he examined the document, a cold realization settled in. This was not incompetence. It was orchestration. Someone wanted to create a paper trail, to fabricate a narrative in which Michael appeared negligent, a homeowner in violation not only of bylaws but of financial obligations. That evening, while sitting on the porch with the jacket hanging beside him, his neighbor, Mr. Lopez, an older widower with a stooped frame and weary eyes, walked slowly up the path. He paused, looked at the uniform, then at Michael, and said in a low voice that trembled slightly, "You are not the first one. They've been doing this for years. My wife, God rest her, received fines for things that didn't exist. When I tried to fight it, they said we had overdue payments we had never owed. She died believing we were about to lose our home. Don't think this is about your jacket alone." Lopez's eyes shifted nervously toward the street as though he feared being overheard, and before Michael could ask more, he turned and walked back toward his own house, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than any argument. For Michael, the catalyst was complete. The uniform was no longer a solitary ritual, but the spark that revealed something rotten beneath the polished surface of the neighborhood. What began as a fine-over fabric had unfolded into the discovery of forged signatures, fabricated documents, and whispered confessions of others who had suffered quietly under the same pressure. He realized that the fight ahead was not only about a jacket on a porch, but about the right to live without the constant shadow of fabricated authority. And, as he sat in the gathering darkness, he understood that he had been chosen for this battle not by accident, but because he refused to bow his head where so many had been forced into silence. Michael had never been the kind of man who sought confrontation, but years of service had taught him that once the first shot was fired, retreat was no longer possible. And now the HOA had fired the first shot with their threats, fines, and forged notices. He decided that ignoring the issue would only invite more pressure, so he prepared himself with meticulous care, gathering the letters, copies of his receipts, and photographs of the uniform hanging neatly on his porch, not as evidence of guilt, but as proof of how absurd the accusations were. On the morning he returned to the HOA office, the air felt heavier, as though the neighborhood itself were holding its breath. He found Don Whitmore waiting for him, not behind the desk this time, but standing in the corridor as if he had expected Michael to come. Don's expression carried the smug patience of a man convinced of his own authority, and without preamble he gestured toward a conference room where 2 other board members were already seated, both with papers in front of them, both refusing to meet. Michael's eyes. The meeting was presented as an informal discussion, yet it quickly revealed itself to be an ambush designed to wear him down. Don began with a polite but firm recitation of the violations, his voice sliding over the words with rehearsed ease, describing Michael's uniform as an unapproved display, and warning of community destabilization if exceptions were allowed. Michael interrupted only once to ask whether they were aware that the supposed updated bylaws contained the name of a man who had been dead for months, but Don dismissed the point with a wave of his hand, claiming that the matter was irrelevant and that continuity of signatures was a common practice. The other board members nodded silently, not out of conviction but out of fear, their eyes betraying unease as if they themselves knew that the explanation was nothing more than a cover. Michael, unwilling to be silenced, pushed the copies of the lien notice and the fine across the table, pointing out the incorrect lot number and the invented dates of delinquency. He expected a response, perhaps even an attempt to fabricate another excuse, but Don simply leaned back in his chair, folded his arms, and said, "Errors happen. What matters is that you comply with the rules. If you continue to resist, the process will move forward, and once it does, you'll find it very difficult to undo." The words were delivered without raised voice, but the quiet menace in them carried the weight of a threat far more dangerous than shouting. Michael realized then that he was not arguing with an organization devoted to fairness or order, but with a machine designed to grind down resistance through fatigue, paperwork, and intimidation. He left the meeting with the bitter taste of futility in his mouth. Yet as he walked home, he noticed Lopez standing at his gate, waiting for him as though he had been watching the entire time. The old man said nothing at first, only handed Michael a folded piece of paper that looked like it had been ripped from a notebook. Written in shaky handwriting was a list of names. Neighbors who had either been fined or pushed into selling their homes under questionable circumstances. Some of the names were marked with crosses, and when Michael asked what that meant, Lopez explained that they were widows, retirees, or people who had left after losing everything. "You are not alone," Lopez said quietly, "but they count on people staying silent, each one thinking they are the only target." Then, with the weary resignation of someone who had lived too long under pressure, he turned and shuffled back toward his house. That night, Michael could not sleep. He sat at the kitchen table surrounded by documents, tracing the patterns of dates, signatures, and numbers until the dawn crept in through the blinds. He noticed that the forged documents all carried the same peculiar mark, a faint indentation in the corner of the page, as if the stamp used had been misaligned, a detail that might go unnoticed by most, but which to him was as obvious as a scar. He realized that these were not isolated mistakes, but deliberate fabrications, repeated with the confidence that no one would dare to question them. His frustration boiled into determination, and he swore that he would not allow his uniform, nor his dignity, to be erased by people who hid behind bylaws like cowards behind barricades. 2 days later, the escalation reached its next level when Michael returned from the grocery store to find a white SUV idling slowly near his driveway. Inside sat 2 men in dark jackets, neither familiar, both watching him with the casual arrogance of people who believed they had the right to occupy any space. One of them rolled down the window and asked if he was Michael Harris. When Michael confirmed, the man held out a clipboard and said they were there to verify his identity in connection with a property compliance review. The phrasing was so vague it sounded invented on the spot, and when Michael asked who had authorized the review, the man merely replied, "The association." Michael refused to hand over his ID, and the man's smile tightened into something cold before he said, "Then don't be surprised if this gets harder for you." The SUV pulled away, slowly, leaving behind an exhaust cloud that lingered in the air like a warning. Michael knew then that the battle had shifted from paperwork to intimidation. The uniform still hung on his porch, but now it seemed less like a simple reminder and more like a target, daring them to come closer. He thought of Lopez's trembling voice, of the crossed-out names on the paper, and realized that the first escalation had already consumed too many before him. Unlike them, however, he was not prepared to bow his head. The uniform was not decoration, and neither was his resolve. If the HOA believed they could erase his history with fines and fabricated documents, they had underestimated the endurance of a man who had survived worse than bureaucracy. The war had only just begun, and Michael felt the old steadiness of battle return to him. Not the chaos of foreign deserts, but the quiet determination of a soldier who knew that retreat was no longer an option. Michael had reached the point where instinct told him that waiting passively would mean slow suffocation under layers of manufactured accusations, so he decided to take the fight into his own hands, not with shouting or public spectacle, but with the precision and persistence he had learned in another life where mistakes carried consequences far heavier than fines. He began by revisiting every document he had received from the HOA, spreading them across his dining table like pieces of a map, and as he traced the dates, addresses, and signatures, he noticed patterns that only became visible when placed side by side. Identical language repeated across different notices, inconsistencies in the use of seals, and, most glaring of all, the appearance of signatures that belonged to people he knew were no longer alive or had moved away years earlier. One in particular drew his attention: the neat, almost delicate signature of Kendall, the architect who had designed many of the houses in the neighborhood, a man who had died months before the bylaws were supposedly updated. The ink on the page was crisp, as if it had been printed yesterday, and Michael could not shake the sense that this was the linchpin in the deception. With the quiet determination of someone who understood that battles were won not by noise but by evidence, he drove to the county records office, a gray building that smelled faintly of mildew and dust, where the clerk at the counter, a middle-aged woman with glasses slipping down her nose, asked him what he needed. Michael presented his address and requested the official HOA filings for the last 5 years. The woman typed slowly into her computer, frowned, and after a pause retrieved a folder thick with papers, which she placed on the counter with a sigh. Michael thanked her, carried the documents to a table in the corner, and began leafing through them, page after page of bylaws, amendments, and notices of meeting minutes. It was in those pages that the truth revealed itself with shocking clarity. The amendments filed in the county's archive bore different signatures than the ones the HOA had presented to him, and nowhere in the official records was Kendall's name attached to anything dated after his death. The versions distributed by the HOA were fabrications, polished enough to fool an inattentive resident but clumsy enough to betray themselves under scrutiny. Michael sat in that cold room for hours, his pen scratching notes into a battered notebook, copying dates and document numbers, building the skeleton of a case he knew he would need to flesh out later. At one point, the clerk passed by and glanced at the spread of papers, and when she saw the duplicated names and mismatched seals, she hesitated, then lowered her voice and said, "You're not the first person to ask about this neighborhood. Something's been off for a while." She would not elaborate, but her words lodged in his mind like a warning. When he left the records office, dusk was falling, and he drove back through the streets of his neighborhood with a new lens through which to see the rows of identical houses and manicured lawns. Each driveway, each porch, each carefully pruned hedge now looked like part of a stage set built to conceal a deeper rot. He realized that the HOA was not merely overzealous in enforcing rules, but had deliberately altered its legal foundation to expand its power, using forged documents to bind residents into obligations they had never agreed to. The uniform hanging on his porch was only the spark. Beneath it lay years of quiet coercion that had pushed others into submission or exile. That night, as Michael organized the copies he had made, Lopez knocked softly on his door. The old man looked exhausted, as though the very act of walking across the lawn had drained him, but in his hand he held a small envelope, yellowed with age. Inside were 3 letters addressed to his late wife, all dated after the day she had died, each one accusing her of failing to maintain her property according to regulations and threatening further action. Lopez's voice cracked as he explained that he had kept them because he could not bear to throw them away, proof that the association had not even respected the fact of her death. Michael studied the letters, the identical language, the cold detachment, and felt his anger harden into resolve. He told Lopez about the forged signatures, about the discrepancies in the county records, and for the first time he saw a flicker of something like hope in the old man's weary eyes. The next morning, Michael visited Clarence, a retired engineer who lived 2 streets over, a man known for his meticulous attention to detail and the blueprints he still kept in his garage from decades of design work. Clarence listened silently as Michael laid out the documents, then asked to see the property maps. Within minutes, his sharp eyes caught something that Michael had overlooked. Several lot numbers had been altered in subtle ways, transposed digits that transformed legal boundaries into something entirely different. Clarence explained that such changes were not accidental. They were deliberate manipulations that allowed properties to be misrepresented, creating opportunities to claim that homeowners owed money or had violated codes. "This is a pattern," Clarence said gravely, "and patterns mean intention." Michael felt the weight of it pressing down on him. The midpoint of his struggle had been reached. He was no longer a man fighting over a jacket on a porch, but a witness to a systematic scheme that had consumed his neighbors for years. As he left Clarence's garage carrying the annotated maps, he understood that he had crossed a line from which there was no return. He could not pretend ignorance, nor could he retreat into silence. The HOA had underestimated him, assuming he would either fold under pressure or isolate himself into passivity, but instead they had awakened the part of him that knew how to gather evidence, how to build a case, and how to endure. That evening, as he sat once more on his porch, the uniform hanging quietly in the fading light, Michael felt a shift inside himself. It was no longer simply about preserving memory or defying arbitrary rules. It was about exposing a deception that thrived on fear and silence. The midpoint had come, the moment when he understood that his private ritual had become the center of a conflict that would either break him or break those who believed they could erase the truth with forged ink and threats. The uniform swayed slightly in the evening breeze, and Michael swore that it would remain there not as a decoration, but as a declaration of war. Michael had reached a point where every step forward revealed not resolution, but a deeper labyrinth. And as soon as he believed he had gathered enough evidence to at least shield himself from the harassment, the HOA escalated in a way that left no doubt they intended not merely to fine or intimidate him, but to crush him entirely. It began with another envelope slipped into his mailbox, heavier than the others, the kind that carried legal weight. Inside was a formal notice announcing that his case had been referred to the HOA's legal counsel, and that failure to comply with all outstanding violations and dues, totaling an amount far beyond anything real, would result in immediate proceedings to place a lien on his property. The document cited statutes and bylaw sections with the kind of precision designed not to clarify but to overwhelm. Yet Michael recognized that many of the citations were either fabricated or mismatched to irrelevant sections. Still, the intent was clear. The machine was moving from intimidation to action. Michael, unwilling to wait passively, returned to Clarence with the document, and together they pored over every line. Clarence, with the patience of a man who had spent his life studying blueprints, identified inconsistencies in the formatting and language, subtle but telling signs of cut-and-paste fraud. "They are not just sloppy," he said quietly, "they are arrogant. They believe no one will ever challenge them." At that moment, Michael realized that arrogance could be their weakness. But before he could even shape a plan, the pressure around him thickened in ways that could not be explained by paper alone. Late one evening, as Michael was driving back from a grocery trip, He noticed headlights in his rearview mirror that remained fixed no matter how many turns he made through the neighborhood. He slowed, pulled to the curb, but the vehicle slowed as well, idling behind him with a patience that spoke of calculated intimidation rather than coincidence. He finally stopped in front of his house, and before he could step out of his truck, the car rolled up beside him. The passenger window lowered to reveal one of the same men he had seen in the white SUV days earlier, the one who had demanded to check his ID. The man leaned slightly out, his voice low and casual, saying, "This would be easier if you just stopped resisting. Everyone else has." Then the window closed and the vehicle rolled away, leaving behind silence so thick it felt suffocating. Michael told himself not to be rattled, but he knew this was the second escalation. They were no longer hiding behind official letters but stepping into his daily life, probing at his resolve, testing whether he would crack under the weight of fear. The next morning, as if to prove the point, he discovered that his recycling bins had been overturned and his driveway scattered with shards of glass. At first glance, it seemed like petty vandalism, but the glass was not random. It was the remnants of a bottle bearing the HOA logo, as though someone had gone out of their way to remind him of exactly who held the hammer poised over him. When Lopez came by later that day, Michael showed him the mess, and the old man shook his head with resignation, muttering that he had once found similar accidents after raising questions about fees years ago. "They do this because they believe no one will speak loudly enough to be heard," Lopez said, his eyes clouded with old grief. "But you might be the one who forces them into the light." His words carried both encouragement and a warning, and Michael understood that his fight was no longer his alone, but the echo of all those who had been silenced before him. Determined not to yield, Michael decided to attend the next HOA meeting, which was open to residents but rarely visited by more than a handful. When he entered the bland community hall, Don Whitmore was already seated at the head of the table, flanked by board members who shuffled papers as though preparing for battle. Michael waited until the formalities concluded, then stepped forward and placed his copies of the county's official records on the table, laying them beside the forged bylaws the HOA had distributed. He spoke not with anger, but with the calm certainty of a man who knew the weight of truth, pointing out the discrepancies, the dead man's signature, the mismatched seals. For a moment the room was silent, tension coiling like a spring, until Don leaned forward, his smile thin and sharp, and said, "Mr. Harris, you are out of line. You have no authority to interpret these documents, and your accusations border on defamation. I strongly advise you to reconsider the consequences of spreading false claims." The threat was delivered in the tone of a man used to obedience, but Michael did not back down. He replied evenly, "I am not interpreting anything. I am reading what is filed at the county. Anyone here is welcome to check for themselves." His words hung in the air, and he noticed flickers of uncertainty in the faces of a few residents who had come merely to observe. Don, sensing his control slipping, abruptly adjourned the meeting, banging his gavel with unnecessary force and declaring that further discussion would take place only in a closed session. When Michael walked out into the night, he felt both a surge of satisfaction and the weight of what would come next. He had drawn blood, not literally, but in the only way that mattered in a battle against deception. He had shown others that cracks existed in the wall, but he also knew that exposing those cracks would provoke retaliation, and it came swiftly. 2 days later, he found a formal complaint taped to his front door, accusing him of hostile conduct toward board members and warning that his behavior placed him at risk of expulsion from the community association. It was a charge without foundation, yet crafted to sound official enough to frighten a less experienced resident. For Michael, it was confirmation. The second escalation was in full swing, and they had chosen to turn their weapons of intimidation fully toward him. He stood on his porch that evening, looking at the uniform swaying gently in the breeze, and he understood that what had begun as a battle over fabric had evolved into something larger, something rooted in the rot of power abused for too long. The escalation was not merely an attempt to silence him, it was the reflex of a system terrified that its fraud might be revealed. And though he felt the exhaustion of being watched, threatened, and harassed, he also felt something else rising beneath it. The unyielding steadiness of a soldier who had faced worse storms than this and who knew that the only way through was forward. The culmination came not in a dramatic outburst of violence, but in the deliberate silence of a courtroom, a place Michael had not expected to find himself, but where every piece of paper, every signature and seal, suddenly carried the weight of testimony louder than words. The case, brought forward after Michael and several neighbors filed formal complaints supported by county records, had been scheduled for months, and during that time the HOA had done everything in its power to intimidate him into withdrawing. More fines, more threats, even a notice claiming his uniform display had created a public safety hazard. Yet the pressure only sharpened his determination, and when he finally entered the courtroom dressed not in his uniform but in a simple suit, carrying his binder of evidence, he felt the same steadiness he had once known before missions where failure was not an option. On the opposing side, Don Whitmore sat with the association's attorney, a man who spoke with the flat authority of someone used to winning battles not with truth but with procedure. Their strategy was to paint Michael as disruptive, to suggest that he was using sentimentality to excuse defiance of community rules, and they began their arguments with rehearsed precision, pointing to bylaws, citing fines, and repeating that the association's actions were lawful. For a while, the courtroom seemed to tilt in their favor, the words stacking up like barricades until Michael's attorney rose and began to dismantle them one by one. She presented the county's official filings, pointing out that the HOA's version of the bylaws bore signatures of individuals who were no longer alive at the time of the supposed approval. She held up the copy with Kendall's name and stated clearly that the man had died months earlier, an irrefutable fact confirmed by death certificates. The silence in the courtroom was profound, broken only by the shuffle of papers as the judge leaned forward to examine the documents. Then came the testimony of Clarence, who explained with calm authority how property maps had been altered, how digits had been transposed in ways that created false violations, his voice steady, his language technical but devastating. Lopez followed, his frail voice describing how his late wife had received threatening letters long after her death, his trembling hands clutching the envelopes as if they were both proof and wound. Each word carved deeper into the illusion the HOA had built, exposing it as not merely an overzealous enforcer of rules, but a predator preying on the vulnerable. When it was Michael's turn, he did not raise his voice or appeal to patriotism. Instead, he spoke with the quiet clarity of a man who understood the difference between discipline and tyranny. He explained what the uniform meant to him, not as decoration but as memory, as a symbol of survival and respect. And then he placed both the forged notices and the official county filings on the table before the judge. "This is not about me resisting rules," he said evenly. "This is about rules being rewritten with lies. If they can forge a dead man's signature, if they can threaten widows with debts that do not exist, then this is not order. It is theft." The judge, a stern woman known for her dislike of theatrics, studied the documents for a long time before finally speaking. Her words were measured but final. The HOA's actions were unlawful. The forged signatures invalidated their authority, and their attempts to impose liens and fines were not only void, but constituted fraudulent practice. The sale threats, the fabricated debts, all were struck down with the weight of the gavel. She ordered the association to compensate the plaintiffs, not with token sums but with damages that reached $1 million, a figure that carried the sting of both punishment and precedent. For a moment, the courtroom remained in stunned silence, the weight of the decision settling like dust after an explosion. Don's face tightened, his carefully constructed confidence unraveling, while Michael sat motionless. the steadiness of his breathing the only sign of release. He had not sought victory in the form of vengeance, but in the restoration of truth. And now the truth had been spoken in the one place where deception could not hide behind bylaws. When the gavel fell and the courtroom emptied, Michael did not feel triumph so much as the deep exhale of a man who had carried a weight too long. And as he walked out into the pale afternoon light with Lopez at his side and Clarence a few steps behind, he realized that the real victory was not the $1,000,000 judgment but the simple fact that the silence had been broken and the fear that had gripped so many had finally lost its hold. In the days that followed the verdict, Don Whitmore vanished from the neighborhood, his house left empty, the blinds drawn, and his name whispered only in fragments of gossip, while the association itself fractured under the weight of audits and investigations that revealed the scale of manipulation it had carried out for years. Some residents who had once avoided Michael now came to his porch to shake his hand, offering words of gratitude, not for the legal settlement but for standing where they could not. The uniform still hung outside, but now it was no longer only his private ritual. It had become a quiet emblem of resilience that others recognized even if they did not speak of it. One evening, Susan, the former pilot, stopped by with a bottle of wine and said that the jacket reminded her of her own flight suit folded away in a trunk, and for the first time in years she felt the urge to bring it out again. Clarence began attending neighborhood meetings not as a reluctant observer but as a voice demanding transparency, while Lopez, though still frail, carried himself with a lighter step, as if a shadow had lifted from his shoulders. Michael himself did not seek leadership. But when the community voted to restructure the association under new management, his name was put forward almost automatically, and though he hesitated, he accepted, not out of ambition, but from the understanding that vigilance was the price of peace. On a quiet morning, weeks later, he stood on his porch with a cup of coffee, the uniform swaying gently in the breeze, the street calm once more, and he thought not of fines or forged papers but of the men and women whose memories the jacket carried. The battle had scarred him in ways that could not be measured by money, yet it had also given him something unexpected, a community no longer ruled by fear, but united by the knowledge that silence could be broken. And as he turned back toward his house, he knew the uniform would remain where it was, not as defiance, not as decoration, but as a reminder that truth, once defended, does not need permission to stand in the open.